Welcome back to Matt Reads Books. I am your host, Matt, and we are on a train today. I'm trying to be quiet so that I don't disturb everybody, even though it's pretty loud on this train. But we are booking on anyway. So without further ado, here is here's the next section of John Rawls' Theory of Justice, beginning with section 7, Intuitionism. So we're going to go for 30 minutes, and then probably finish out whatever section we're on. And I can't use a timer like I could last time, so I guess we're just going to have to wing it. So anyway, I'm going to put this down somewhere, and you will periodically see, this is entirely for me, remember. This isn't for the audience, so, if you don't like it, I'm sorry. But anyway, here we go. I shall think of intuitionism in a more general way than is customary, namely as the doctrine that there is an irreducible family of first principles, which have to be weighed against one another by asking ourselves which balance, in our considered judgment, is the most just. Once we reach a certain level of generality, the intuitionist maintains that there exists no higher order constructive criteria for determining the proper emphasis for the competing principles of justice. While the complexity of the moral facts require a number of distinct principles, there is no single standard that accounts for them or assigns them their weights. Intuitionist theories, then, have two features. First, they consist of a plurality of first principles which may conflict to give contrary directives in particular types of cases. And second, they include no explicit method, no priority rules for weighing these principles against one another, but simply to strike a balance by intuition, by what seems to us most nearly right. Or, if there are priority rules, these are thought to be more or less trivial and of no substantial assistance in reaching a verdict. Then he gives footnote 18. Intuitionist theories of this type are found in Brian Barry, Political Argument, Brandt's Ethical Theory, and Rescher's Distributive Justice. And apparently Robert Nozick discusses some of the problems in an essay of his. And of course there are a few other traditional senses of intuitionism, such as G.E. Moore's, Pritchard, Ross, and even the 18th century treatise by Richard Price, Review of the Principal Questions of Morals, etc. So, various other contentions are commonly associated with intuitionism. For example, that the concepts of the right and the good are unanalyzable. Moral principles, when suitably formulated, express self-evident propositions about legitimate moral claims, and so on. But I shall leave these matters aside. These characteristic epistemological doctrines are not a necessary part of intuitionism as I understand it. Perhaps it would be better if we were to speak of intuitionism in the broad sense as pluralism. Still, a conception of justice can be pluralistic without requiring us to weigh its principles by intuition. It may contain the requisite priority rules. To emphasize the direct appeal of our considered judgment in the balancing of principles, it seems appropriate to think of intuitionism in this more general fashion. How far such a theory is committed to certain epistemological theories is a separate question. Now so understood, there are many kinds of intuitionism. Not only are our everyday notions of this type, but so perhaps are most philosophical doctrines. One way of distinguishing between intuitionist views is by the level of generality of their principles. Common sense intuitionism takes the form of groups of rather specific precepts, each group applying to a particular problem of justice. There is a group of precepts which applies to the question of fair wages, another to that of taxation, still another to punishment, and so on. In arriving at the notion of a fair wage, say, we are to balance somehow various competing criteria, for example, the claims of skill, training, effort, responsibility, and the hazards of the job, as well as to make some allowance for need. No one presumably would decide by any one of these precepts alone, and some compromise between them must be struck. The determination of wages by existing institutions also represents, in effect, particular weighting of these claims. This weighting, however, is normally influenced by the demands of different social interests, and so by relative positions of power and influence. It may not, therefore, conform to anyone's conception of a fair wage. This is particularly likely to be true, since persons with different interests are likely to stress the criteria which advance their ends. Those with more ability and education are prone to emphasize claims of skill and training, whereas those lacking these advantages urge the claim of need. But not only are our everyday ideas of justice influenced by our own situation, they are also strongly colored by custom and current expectations. And by what criteria are we to judge the justice of custom itself and the legitimacy of these expectations? To reach some measure of understanding and agreement which goes beyond a mere de facto resolution of competing interests and reliance on existing conventions and established expectations, it is necessary to move to a more general scheme for determining the balance of precepts, or at least for confining it within narrower limits. Thus, we can consider the problem of justice by reference to certain ends of social policy. Yet this approach also... Here, let's try this. Yet this approach also is likely to rely on intuition, since it normally takes the form of balancing various economic and social objectives. For example, suppose that allocative efficiency, full employment, a larger national income, and its more equal distribution are accepted as social ends. Then, given the desired weighting of these aims and the existing institutional setup, the precepts of fair wages, just taxation, and so on will receive their due emphasis. In order to achieve greater efficiency and equity, one may follow a policy which has the effect of stressing skill and effort in the payment of wages, leaving the precept of need to be handled in some other fashion, perhaps by welfare transfers. An intuitionism of social ends provides a basis for deciding whether the determination of fair wages makes sense in view of the taxes to be imposed. How we weigh the precepts in one group is adjusted to how we weigh them in another. In this way, we have managed to introduce a certain coherence into our judgments of justice. We have moved beyond the narrow de facto compromise of interests to a wider view. Of course, we're still left with an appeal to intuition and the balancing of the higher order ends of policy themselves. Differing weightings for these are not by any means trivial variations, but often correspond to profoundly opposed political convictions. The principles of political conceptions are, for the most part, are of the most general kind. Not only are they intended to account for the ends of social policy, but the emphasis assigned to these principles should correspondingly determine the balance of these ends. For purposes of illustration, let us discuss a rather simple yet familiar conception based on the aggregative distributive dichotomy. It has two principles. The basic structure of society is to be designed first to produce the most good in the sense of the greatest net balance of satisfaction, and second to produce satisfactions equally. Both principles have, of course, ceteris paribus clauses. The first principle, the principle of utility, acts in this case as a standard of efficiency, urging us to produce as large a total as we can, other things equal. Whereas the second principle serves as a standard of justice, constraining the pursuit of aggregate well-being and evening out of the distribution of advantages. This conception is intuitionist because no priority rule is provided for determining how these two principles are to be balanced against each other. Widely different weights are consistent with accepting these principles. No doubt, it is natural to make certain assumptions about how most people would in fact balance them. For one thing, in different combinations of total satisfaction and different degrees of equality, we presumably would give these principles different weights. For example, if there is a large total satisfaction but it is unequally distributed, we would probably think it more urgent to increase equality than if the large aggregate well-being were already rather evenly shared. This can be put more formally by using the economist's device of indifference curves. Assume that we can measure the extent to which particular arrangements of basic structure satisfy these principles, and represent total satisfaction on the positive x-axis and equality on the positive y-axis. The latter may be supposed to have an upper bound and perfect equality. The extent to which an arrangement of the basic structure fulfills these principles can now be represented by a point in the plane. Now, clearly, a point which is northeast of another is a better arrangement. It is superior on both counts. For example, the point B, and then he just goes on to explain the graph. For example, the point B is better than the point A in figure 1. Indifference curves are formed by connecting points judged equally just. Thus, curve I in figure 1 consists of the points ranked equally with point A, which lies on that curve. Curve II consists of the points ranked along with point B, and so on. We may assume that these curves slope downward to the right, and also that they do not intersect, otherwise the judgments they represent would be inconsistent. The slope of the curve at any point expresses the relative weights of equality and total satisfaction, and the combination the point represents. The changing slope along an indifference curve shows how the relative urgency of the principle shifts as they are more or less satisfied. Sorry. Well, the train thing was a bit difficult, it seems. Golly. Anyway, so now I'm in New York. Anyway. Well, I guess actually I could start a timer at this point, right? Let's see, we've been going for about 8 minutes of actual time, it seems, so let's try 22 minutes. Okay. Okay. Thus, moving along either of the indifference curves in figure 1, we see that as equality decreases, a larger and larger increase in the sum of satisfactions is required to compensate for a further decrease in equality. Moreover, very different weightings are consistent with these principles. Let figure 2 represent the judgments of two different persons. The solid lines depict the judgments of the one who gives a relatively strong weight to equality, while the dashed lines depict the judgments of the other who gives a relatively strong weight to total welfare. Thus, while the first person ranks arrangement D equal with C, the second judges D superior. The conception of justice imposes no limitations on what are the correct weightings, and therefore it allows different persons to arrive at a different balance of principles. Nevertheless, such an intuitionist conception, if it were to fit our considered judgments on reflection, would be by no means without importance. At least it would single out the criteria which are significant and apparent axes, so to speak, of our considered judgments of social justice. The intuitionist hopes that once these axes or principles are identified, men will in fact balance them more or less similarly, at least when they are impartial and not moved by an excessive attention to their own interests. Or if this is not so, then at least they can agree to some scheme whereby their assignment of weights can be compromised. It is essential to observe that the intuitionist does not deny that we can describe how we balance competing principles, or how any one man does so, supposing that we weigh them differently. The intuitionist grants the possibility that these weights can be depicted by indifference curves. Knowing the description of these weights, the judgments which will be made can be foreseen. In this sense, the judgments have a consistent and definite structure. Of course, it may be claimed that in the assignment of weights we are guided, without being aware of it, by certain further standards, or by how best to realize a certain end. Perhaps the weights we assign are those which would result if we were to apply these standards or to pursue this end. Admittedly, any given balancing of principles is subject to interpretation in this way, but the intuitionist claims that, in fact, there is no such interpretation. He contends that there exists no expressible ethical conception which underlies these weights. A geometrical figure or a mathematical function may describe them, but there are no constructive moral criteria that establish their reasonableness. Intuitionism holds that in our judgments of social justice, we must eventually reach a plurality of first principles in regard to which we can only say that it seems to us more correct to balance them this way rather than that. Now, there is nothing intrinsically irrational about this intuitionist doctrine. Indeed, it may be true. We cannot take for granted that there must be a complete derivation of our judgments of social justice from recognizably ethical principles. The intuitionist believes, to the contrary, that the complexity of the moral facts defies our efforts to give a full account of our judgments and necessitates a plurality of competing principles. He contends that attempts to go beyond these principles either reduce to triviality, as when it is said that social justice is to give every man his due, or else lead to falsehood and oversimplification, as when one settles everything by the principle of utility. The only way, therefore, to dispute intuitionism is to set forth the recognizably ethical criteria that account for the weights which, in our considered judgments, we think appropriate to give to the plurality of principles. A refutation of intuitionism consists in presenting the sort of constructive criteria which are said not to exist. To be sure, the notion of a recognizably ethical principle is vague, although it is easy to give many examples drawn from tradition and common sense. But it is pointless to discuss this matter in the abstract. The intuitionist and his critic will have to settle this question once the latter has put forward his more systematic account. It may be asked whether intuitionistic theories are teleological or deontological. They may be of either kind, and an ethical view is bound to rely on intuition to some degree at many points. For example, one could maintain, as Moore did, that personal affection and human understanding, in creation and the contemplation of beauty, and the gaining and appreciation of knowledge, are the chief good things, along with pleasure. And one might also maintain, as Moore did not, that these are the sole intrinsic goods. Since these values are specified independently from the right, we have a teleological theory of a perfectionist type, if the right is defined as maximizing the good. Yet in estimating what yields the most good, the theory may hold that these values have to be balanced against each other by intuition. It may say that there are no substantive criteria for guidance here. Often, however, intuitionist theories are deontological. In the definitive presentation of Rawls, the distribution of good things according to moral worth, distributive justice, is included among the goods to be advanced. And while the principle to produce the most good ranks as a first principle, it is but one such principle, and must be balanced by intuition against the claims of the other prima facie principles. And with a citation to Rawls's The Right and the Good. The distinctive feature, then, of intuitionistic views is not their being teleological or deontological, but the especially prominent place that they give to the appeal to our intuitive capacities, unguided by constructive and recognizably ethical criteria. Intuitionism denies that there exists any useful and explicit solution to the priority problem. I now turn to a brief discussion of this topic. And of course, Section 8 is titled The Priority Problem. The priority problem. We have seen that intuitionism raises the question of the extent to which it is possible to give a systematic account of our considered judgments of the just and the unjust. In particular, it holds that no constructive answer can be given to the problem of assigning weights to competing principles of justice. Here, at least, we must rely on our intuitive capacities. Classical utilitarianism tries, of course, to avoid the appeal to intuition altogether. It is a single principle conception with one ultimate standard. The adjustment of weights is, in theory anyway, settled by reference to the principle of utility. Mill thought that there must be but one such standard, otherwise there would be no umpire between competing criteria, and Sidgwick argues at length that the utilitarian principle is the only one which can assume this role. They maintain that our moral judgments are implicitly utilitarian, in the sense that when confronted with a clash of precepts, or with notions which are vague and imprecise, we have no alternative except to adopt utilitarianism. Mill and Sidgwick believe that at some point we must have a single principle to straighten out and to systematize our judgments. In a citation to Mill's A System of Logic and Utilitarianism, and Sidgwick's The Method of Ethics. Mill and Sidgwick believe that at some point We must have a single principle to straighten out and to systematize our judgments. Undeniably, one of the great attractions of the classical doctrine is the way it faces the priority problem and tries to avoid relying on intuition. As I have already remarked, there is nothing necessarily irrational in the appeal to intuition to settle questions of priority. We must recognize the possibility that there is no way to get beyond a plurality of principles. No doubt, any conception of justice will have to rely on intuition to some degree. Nevertheless, we should do what we can to reduce the direct appeal to our considered judgments. For if men balance final principles differently, as presumably they often do, then their conceptions of justice are different. The assignment of weights is an essential and not a minor part of a conception of justice. If we cannot explain how these weights are to be determined by reasonable ethical criteria, the means of rational discussion have come to an end. An intuitionist conception of justice is, one might say, but half a conception. We should do what we can to formulate explicit principles for the priority problem, even though the dependence on intuition cannot be entirely eliminated, or cannot be eliminated entirely. In justice's fairness, the role of intuition is limited in several ways. Since the whole question is rather difficult, I shall only make a few comments here, the full sense of which will not be clear until later on. The first point is connected with the fact that the principles of justice are those which would be chosen in the original position. They are the outcome of a certain choice situation. Now, being rational, the persons in the original position recognize that they should consider the priority of these principles. For if they wish to establish agreed standards for adjudicating their claims on one another, they will need principles for assigning weights. They cannot assume that their intuitive judgments of priority will in general be the same. Given their different positions in society, they surely will not. Thus, I suppose that in the original position, the parties try to reach some agreement as to how the principles of justice are to be balanced. Now, part of the value of the notion of choosing principles is that the reasons which underlie their adoption in the first place may also support giving them certain weights. Since in justice as fairness, the principles of justice are not thought of as self-evident, but have their justification in the fact that they would be chosen, we may find in the grounds for their acceptance some guidance or limitation as to how they are to be balanced. Given the situation of the original position, it may be clear that certain priority rules are preferable to others for much the same reasons that principles are initially assented to. By emphasizing the role of justice and the special features of the initial choice situation, the priority problem may prove more tractable. A second possibility is that we may be able to find principles which can be put in what I shall call a serial or lexical order. And he has a footnote explaining what that means. The term lexicographical derives from the fact that the most familiar example of such an ordering is that of words in a dictionary. To see this, substitute numerals for letters, putting 1 for A and 2 for B, and so on, and then rank the resulting strings of numerals from left to right, moving to the right only when necessary to break ties. In general, a lexical ordering cannot be represented by a continuous, real-valued utility function. Such a ranking violates the assumption of continuity. So this is similar to ordinal utility, it looks. And he cites a contribution to demand analysis and Sen's collective choice and social welfare, which actually might be quite worth reading. Maybe we'll add that to the books. In the history of moral philosophy, the conception of a lexical order occasionally appears, though it is not explicitly discussed. A clear example found in Hutcheson's A System of Moral Philosophy. He proposes that in comparing pleasures of the same kind, we use their intensity and duration. In comparing pleasures of different kind, we must consider their duration and dignity jointly. Pleasures of higher kinds may have a greater worth, and those of lower kinds have great the latter's intensity and duration. And of course, this is familiar in Mill as well. This also happens apparently in Ross. And of course, the primacy of justice noted in section 1, and the priority of right is also found in Kant, which is another example of such an ordering. Apparently, the theory of utility in economics has an implicit recognition of the hierarchical structure of wants, such as in Jevons or Jevons, the theory of political economy, states a conception analogous to Hutcheson's and confines the economist's use of utility calculus to the lowest rank of feelings. And then there's a recommendation for Georgescu-Roegen's choice expectations and measurability. But I think the point is, I mean, to me at least, it seems like it's talking about basically ordinality versus cardinality. So he's using lexical instead of lexicographical because it's too cumbersome. So that's what he says next. The correct term is lexicographical, but it is too cumbersome. This is an order which requires us to satisfy the first principle in the ordering before we can move on to the second before we consider the third, and so on. A principle does not come into play until those previous to it are either fully met or do not apply. A serial ordering avoids, then, having to balance principles at all. Those earlier in the ordering have an absolute weight, so to speak, with respect to later ones, and hold without exception. We can regard such a ranking as analogous to a sequence of constrained maximum principles, for we can suppose that any principle in the order is to be maximized subject to the condition that the preceding principles are fully satisfied. As an important special case, I shall, in fact, propose an ordering of this kind by ranking the principle of equal liberty prior to the principle regulating economic and social inequalities. This means, in effect, that the basic structure of society is to arrange the inequalities of wealth and authority in ways consistent with the equal liberties required by the preceding principle. Certainly the concept of a lexical or serial order does not offhand seem very promising. Indeed, it appears to offend our sense of moderation and good judgment. Moreover, it presupposes that the principles in the order be of a rather special kind. For example, unless the earlier principles have but a limited application and establish definite requirements which can be fulfilled, later principles will never come into play. Thus the principle of equal liberty can assume a prior position, since it may, let us suppose, be satisfied, whereas if the principle of utility were first, it would render autois, O-T-I-O-S-E, all subsequent criteria. I shall try to show that at least in certain social circumstances, a serial ordering of the principles of justice offers an approximate solution to the priority problem. Finally, the dependence on intuition can be reduced by posing more limited questions and by substituting prudential for moral judgment. Thus, someone faced with the principles of an intuitionist conception may reply without some guidelines for deliberation, he does not know what to say. He might maintain, for example, that he could not balance total utility against equality in the distribution of satisfaction. Not only are the notions involved here too abstract and comprehensive for him to have any confidence in his judgment, but there are enormous complications in interpreting what they mean. The aggregative distributive dichotomy is no doubt an attractive idea, but in this instance it seems unmanageable. It does not factor the problem of social justice into small enough parts. In justice's fairness, the appeal to intuition is focused in two ways. First, we single out a certain position in the social system from which the system is to be judged, and then we ask whether, from the standpoint of a representative man in this position, it would be rational to prefer this arrangement to the basic structure rather than that. Given certain assumptions, economic and social inequalities are to be judged in terms of the long-run expectations of the least advantaged social group. Of course, the specification of this group is not very exact, and certainly our prudential judgments likewise give considerable scope to intuition, since we may not be able to formulate the principle which determines them. Nevertheless, we have asked a much more limited question, and have substituted for an ethical judgment a judgment of rational prudence. Often it is quite clear how we should decide. The reliance on intuition is of a different nature, and much less than in aggregate than in the aggregative distributive dichotomy of the intuitionist conception. In addressing the priority problem, the task is that of reducing and not of eliminating entirely the reliance on intuitive judgments. There is no reason to suppose that we can avoid all appeals to intuition of whatever kind, or that we should try to. The practical aim is to reach a reasonably reliable agreement in judgment in order to provide a common conception of justice. If men's intuitive priority judgments are similar, it does not matter, practically speaking, that they cannot formulate the principles which account for these convictions, or even whether such principles exist. Contrary judgments, however, raise a difficulty, since the basis for adjudicating claims is to that extent obscure. Thus our object should be to formulate a conception of justice which, however much it may call upon intuition, ethical or prudential, tends to make our considered judgments of justice converge. If such a conception does exist, then, from the standpoint of the original position, there would be strong reasons for accepting it, since it is rational to introduce further coherence into our common convictions of justice. Indeed, once we look at things from the standpoint of the initial situation, the priority problem is not that of how to cope with the complexity of already given moral facts which cannot be altered. Instead, it is the problem of formulating reasonable and generally acceptable proposals for bringing about the desired agreement in judgments. On contract doctrine, the moral facts are determined by the principles which would be chosen in the original position. These principles specify which considerations are relevant from the standpoint of social justice. Since it is up to the persons in the original position to choose those principles, it is for them to decide how simple or complex they want the moral facts to be. The original agreement settles how far they are prepared to compromise and to simplify in order to establish the priority rules necessary for a common conception of justice. I have reviewed two obvious and simple ways of dealing constructively with the priority problem, namely either by a single overall principle or by a plurality of principles in lexical order. Other ways no doubt exist, but I shall not consider what they might be. The traditional moral theories are for the most part single-principled or intuitionistic, so that the working out of a single ordering is novelty enough for a first step. While it seems clear that, in general, a lexical order cannot be strictly correct, it may be an illuminating approximation under certain special, though significant conditions, see section 82. In this way, it may indicate the larger structure of conceptions of justice and suggest the directions along which a closer fit can be found. And then section 9. Which brings us to the end of chapter 1. Some remarks about moral theory. It seems desirable at this point. We're going to go ahead and turn off the timer because I'm just going to go through this. It seems desirable at this point, in order to prevent misunderstanding, to discuss briefly the nature of moral theory. I shall do this by explaining in more detail the concept of a considered judgment in reflective equilibrium and the reasons for introducing it. Let us assume that each person beyond a certain age and possessed of the requisite intellectual capacity develops a sense of justice under normal circumstances. We acquire a skill in judging things to be just and unjust and in supporting these judgments by reasons. Moreover, we ordinarily have some desire to act in accord with these pronouncements and expect a similar desire on the part of others. Clearly, this moral capacity is extraordinarily complex. To see this, it suffices to note the potentially infinite number and variety of judgments that we are prepared to make. The fact that we often do not know what to say and sometimes find our minds unsettled does not detract from the complexity of the capacity we have. Now one may think of moral theory at first, and I stress the provisional nature of this view, as the attempt to describe our moral capacity. Or, in the present case, one may regard a theory of justice as describing our sense of justice. By such a description, is not meant simply a list of the judgments on institutions and actions that we are prepared to render, accompanied with supporting reasons when these are offered. Rather, what is required is a formulation of a set of principles which, when conjoined to our beliefs and knowledge of the circumstances, would lead us to make these judgments with their supporting reasons, were we to apply these principles conscientiously and intelligently. A conception of justice characterizes our moral sensibility when the everyday judgments we do make are in accordance with its principles. These principles can serve as part of the premises of an argument which arrives at the matching judgments. We do not understand our sense of justice until we know in some systematic way, covering a wide range of cases, what these principles are. A useful comparison here is with the problem of describing the sense of grammaticalness that we have for the sentences of our native language. In this case, the aim is to characterize the ability to recognize well-formed sentences by formulating clearly expressed principles which make the same discriminations as the native speaker. This undertaking is known to require theoretical constructions that far outrun the ad hoc precepts of our explicit grammatical knowledge. A similar situation presumably holds in moral theory. There is no reason to assume that our sense of justice can be adequately characterized by familiar common sense precepts or derived from the more obvious learning principles. A correct account of moral capacities will certainly involve principles and theoretical constructions which go much beyond the norms and standards cited in everyday life. It may eventually require fairly sophisticated mathematics as well. Thus, the idea of the original position and of an agreement on principles there does not seem too complicated or unnecessary. Indeed, these notions are rather simple and can serve only as a beginning. So far, though, I have not said anything about considered judgments. Now, as already suggested, they enter as those judgments in which our moral capacities are most likely to be displayed without distortion. Thus, in deciding which of our judgments to take into account, we may reasonably select some and exclude others. For example, we can discard those judgments made with hesitation, or in which we have little confidence. Similarly, those given when we are upset or frightened, or when we stand to gain one way or the other, can be left aside. All these judgments are likely to be erroneous, or to be influenced by an excessive attention to our own interests. Considered judgments are simply those rendered under conditions favorable to the exercise of the sense of justice, and therefore in circumstances where the more common excuses and explanations for making a mistake do not obtain. The person making the judgment is presumed then to have the ability, the opportunity, and the desire to reach a correct decision, or at least not the desire not to. Moreover, the criteria that identify these judgments are not arbitrary. They are, in fact, similar to those that single out considered judgments of any kind, and once we regard the sense of justice as a mental capacity, as involving the exercise of thought, the relevant judgments are those given under considerations favorable for deliberation and judgment in general. I now turn to the notion of reflective equilibrium. The need for this idea arises as follows. According to the provisional aim of moral philosophy, one might say that justice as fairness is the hypothesis that the principles which would be chosen in the original position are identical with those that match our considered judgments, and so these principles describe our sense of justice. But this interpretation is clearly oversimplified. In describing our sense of justice, an allowance must be made for the likelihood that considered judgments are no doubt subject to certain irregularities and distortions, despite the fact that they are rendered under favorable circumstances. When a person is presented with an intuitively appealing account of his sense of justice, one, say, which embodies various reasonable and natural presumptions, he may well revise his judgments to conform to his principles, even though the theory does not fit his existing judgments exactly. He is especially likely to do this if he can find an explanation for the deviations which undermines his confidence in his original judgments, and if the conception presented yields a judgment which he finds he can now accept. From the standpoint of moral theory, the best account of a person's sense of justice is not the one which fits his judgments prior to his examining any conception of justice, but rather the one which matches his judgments in reflective equilibrium. As we have seen, this state is one reached after a person has weighed various proposed conceptions, and he has either revised his judgments to accord with one of them, or held fast to his initial convictions and the corresponding conception. There are, however, several interpretations of reflective equilibrium, for the notion varies depending on whether one is to be presented with only those descriptions which more or less match one's existing judgments, except for minor discrepancies, or whether one is to be presented with all possible descriptions to which one might plausibly conform one's judgments, together with all relevant philosophical arguments for them. In the first case, we would be describing a person's sense of justice more or less as it is, although allowing for the smoothing out of certain irregularities. In the second case, a person's sense of justice may or may not undergo a radical shift. Clearly, it is the second kind of reflective equilibrium that one is concerned with in moral philosophy. To be sure, it is doubtful whether one can ever reach this state. For even if the idea of all possible descriptions and of all philosophically relevant arguments is well defined, which is questionable, we cannot examine each of them. The most we can do is to study the conceptions of justice known to us through the tradition of moral philosophy, and any further ones that occur to us, and then to consider these. This is pretty much what I shall do, since in presenting justice as fairness, I shall compare its principles and arguments with a few other familiar views. In light of these remarks, justice as fairness can be understood as saying that the two principles previously mentioned would be chosen in the original position in preference to other traditional conceptions of justice, for example, those of utility and perfection, and that these principles give a better match with our considered judgments on reflection than these recognized alternatives. Thus, justice as fairness moves us closer to the philosophical ideal. It does not, of course, achieve it. This explanation of reflective equilibrium suggests straight away a number of further questions. For example, does a reflective equilibrium, in the sense of the philosophical ideal, exist? If so, is it unique? Even if it is unique, can it be reached? Perhaps the judgments from which we begin, or the course of reflection itself, or both, affect the resting point, if any, that we eventually achieve. It would be useless, however, to speculate about these matters here. They are far beyond our reach. I shall not even ask whether the principles that characterize one person's considered judgments are the same as those that characterize another's. I shall take for granted that these principles are either approximately the same for persons whose judgments are in reflective equilibrium, or if not, that their judgments divide along a few main lines represented by the family of traditional doctrines that I shall discuss. Indeed, one person may find himself torn between opposing conceptions at the same time. If men's conceptions of justice finally turn out to differ, the ways in which they do so is a matter of first importance. Of course, we cannot know how these conceptions vary, or even whether they do, until we have a better account of their structure. And this we now lack, even in the case of one man or homogeneous group of men. If we can characterize one educated person's sense of justice, we might have a good beginning toward a theory of justice. We may suppose that everyone has in himself the whole form of the moral conception. So for the purposes of this book, the views of the reader and the author are the only ones that count. The opinions of others are used only to clear our own heads. I wish to stress that in its initial stages at least, a theory of justice is precisely that, namely, a theory. It is a theory of the moral sentiments. Do you recall an 18th century title? That's hilarious. Setting out the principles governing our moral powers, or more specifically, our sense of justice. There is a definite, if limited, class of facts against which conjectured principles can be checked, namely, are considered judgments in reflective equilibrium. A theory of justice is subject to the same rules of method as other theories. Definitions and analyses of meaning do not have a special place. Definition is but one device, used in setting up the general structure of theory. Once the whole framework is worked out, definitions have no distinct status and stand or fall with the theory itself. In any case, it's obviously impossible to develop a substantive theory of justice founded solely on truths of logic and definition. The analysis of moral concepts, and the a priori, however traditionally understood, is too slender a basis. Moral theory must be free to use contingent assumptions and general facts as it pleases. So here he's opposing mere concept analysis. And for a wider circle reasoning. There's no other way to give an account of our considered judgments in reflective equilibrium. This is the conception of the subject adopted by most classical British writers through Sidgwick. I see no reason to depart from it. And then he cites, in footnote 26, he cites the Nicomachean Ethics and Hardy's Aristotle's Ethical Theory, and Sidgwick again, and Schneewind, First Principles and Common Sense Morality in Sidgwick's Ethics in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie. Moreover, we can find an accurate account of our moral conceptions. If we can find an accurate account of our moral conceptions, then questions of meaning and justification may prove much easier to answer. Indeed, some of them may no longer be real questions at all. Note, for example, the extraordinary deepening of our understanding of the meaning and justification of statements in logic and mathematics, made possible by developments since Frege and Cantor. A knowledge of the fundamental structures of logic and set theory and their relation to mathematics has transformed the philosophy of these subjects in a way that conceptual analysis and linguistic investigations never could. One has only to observe the effect of the division of theories into those which are decidable and complete, undecidable yet complete, and neither complete nor decidable. The problem of meaning and truth in logic and mathematics is profoundly altered by the discovery of logical systems illustrating these concepts. Once the substantive content of moral conceptions is better understood, a similar transformation may occur. It is possible that convincing answers to questions of the meaning and justification of moral judgments can be found in no other way. I wish then to stress the central place of the study of our substantive moral conceptions. The corollary to recognizing their complexity is accepting the fact that our present theories are primitive and have grave defects. We need to be tolerant of simplifications if they reveal and approximate the general outlines of our judgments. Objections by way of counterexamples are to be made with care, since these may tell us only what we know already, namely that our theory is wrong somewhere. The important thing is to find out how often and how far it is wrong. All theories are presumably mistaken in places. The real question at any given time is which of the views already proposed is the best approximation overall. To ascertain this, some grasp of the structure of rival theories is surely necessary. It is for this reason that I have tried to classify and to discuss conceptions of justice by reference to their basic intuitive ideas, since these disclose the main differences between them. In presenting justice as fairness, I shall contrast it with utilitarianism. I do this for various reasons, partly as an expository device, partly because the several variants of the utilitarian view have long dominated our philosophical tradition and continue to do so. And this dominance has been maintained despite the persistent misgivings that utilitarianism so easily arouses. The explanation for this peculiar state of affairs lies, I believe, in the fact that no constructive alternative theory has been advanced, which has the comparable virtues of clarity and system, and which at the same time allays these doubts. Intuitionism is not constructive, perfectionism is unacceptable. My conjecture is that the contract doctrine properly worked out, can fill this gap. I think justice is fairness, an endeavor in this direction. Of course, the contract theory, as I shall present it, is subject to the strictures that we have just noted. It is no exception to the primitiveness that marks existing moral theories. It is disheartening, for example, how little can now be said about priority rules, and while lexical ordering may serve fairly well for some important cases, I assume that it will not be completely satisfactory. Nevertheless, we're free to use simplifying devices, and this I've often done. We should view a theory of justice as a guiding framework designed to focus our moral sensibilities and to put before our intuitive capacities more limited and manageable questions for judgment. The principles of justice identify certain considerations as morally relevant, and the priority rules indicate the appropriate precedents when these conflict, while the conception of the original position defines the underlying idea which is to inform our deliberations. If the scheme as a whole seems on reflection to clarify and to order our thoughts, if it tends to reduce disagreements and to bring divergent convictions more into line, then it has done all that one may reasonably ask. Understood as parts of a framework that does indeed seem to help, the numerous simplifications may be regarded as provisionally justified. Okay, and now we've made it to Chapter 2, the Principles of Justice, but we're way over time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here and go to sleep. Thanks so much for tuning into Matt Reads Books. Look forward to reading some more books tomorrow.